Imagine a moment, not on the bloody battlefields of Europe, nor in the silent depths of the U-boat-infested Atlantic, but in a quiet smoke-filled room in Berlin. Imagine a group of highly intelligent, dedicated German analysts, poring over documents, their faces etched with the strain of war. They weren't looking at battle plans, or troop movements, or the latest breakthroughs in weaponry. No, they were looking at something far more mundane, yet infinitely more terrifying. American supply charts. And in those charts, in the cold, hard numbers, they saw not just the strength of their enemy, but the undeniable, mathematical certainty of their own defeat. The Second World War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, often conjures images of tank battles, aerial dogfights, and desperate trench warfare. But beneath the thunder of cannons and the roar of engines, there was another, far more insidious battle being fought, a battle of logistics, of production, of raw materials, and of the sheer unyielding capacity to sustain a global war. For Germany, a nation with grand ambitions but limited resources, this hidden war would prove to be its ultimate undoing. When the German war machine roared to life in September 1939, it seemed unstoppable. The Blitzkrieg, a revolutionary doctrine of rapid, coordinated attacks, swept through Poland, then Denmark and Norway, and most shockingly, through France in a matter of weeks. The world watched in awe and terror as the Wehrmacht, with its panzer divisions and Stuka dive bombers, dismantled centuries-old empires. The initial successes were intoxicating. They fueled the belief within the German high command, and indeed, within the general population, that their military genius, their superior technology, and their unwavering will would lead them to victory. Europe, they believed, would soon be theirs, and the world would follow. This early period was marked by a sense of invincibility, a feeling that German ingenuity and strategic brilliance could overcome any obstacle, including the sheer weight of numbers from their adversaries. But even amidst these early triumphs, the seeds of future problems were being sown. Germany, despite its industrial prowess, was not a resource-rich nation. It lacked vast reserves of oil, iron, or rubber, and many other critical raw materials essential for a prolonged, mechanized war. The Blitzkrieg worked by being fast, by seizing resources and industrial capacity from conquered nations, and by avoiding a protracted war of attrition. The plan was to win quickly, before the inherent resource limitations could cripple the war effort. The initial campaigns, being relatively short, did not expose the full extent of these logistical vulnerabilities. The captured territories provided temporary relief, but they also expanded the perimeter that needed to be defended and supplied, creating a constantly growing logistical challenge that was often underestimated. The German war machine was a marvel of engineering and organization, but it was also a hungry beast. It devoured fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and manpower at an astonishing rate. To keep its tanks rolling, its planes flying, and its U-boats hunting, an intricate and robust supply chain was absolutely critical. Yet, compared to the sprawling global empires of Britain and France, and especially compared to the industrial behemoth across the Atlantic, Germany's logistical infrastructure was always playing catch-up. Their railway network, while efficient, was primarily designed for internal European transport, not for supplying armies thousands of miles away across vast, underdeveloped territories, as they would discover on the Eastern Front. Their merchant fleet, once respectable, was quickly decimated by the Royal Navy, leaving them reliant on land routes and limited coastal shipping. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, marked a turning point, not just militarily, but logistically. This was a war on an entirely different scale. The vast distances, the harsh climate, and the underdeveloped infrastructure of Eastern Europe stretched German supply lines to breaking point. Trucks broke down, locomotives ran out of fuel, and the sheer volume of supplies needed for millions of men and thousands of vehicles became an insurmountable problem. The German army, designed for short, decisive campaigns, found itself bogged down in a logistical nightmare, fighting a war of attrition it was ill-equipped to win. The winter of 1941-42, with its brutal cold and frozen supply lines, exposed these vulnerabilities in the most devastating way imaginable, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and vast amounts of equipment. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a sleeping giant was stirring. The United States, initially committed to neutrality, had been slowly preparing for war, providing crucial aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act. With the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America officially entered the fray, unleashing an industrial capacity the world had never seen. The sheer scale of American manufacturing was almost incomprehensible. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, which had been churning out cars, quickly retooled their factories to produce tanks, planes, and jeeps. Shipyards, which had been building a handful of vessels, began launching Liberty ships at an astonishing rate, sometimes one every few days. This wasn't just about building more. It was about building faster, more efficiently, and on a scale that defied imagination. The United States possessed vast natural resources, a well-developed industrial base, and a population that could be mobilized for war production without crippling its civilian economy. This was the true, silent weapon of the Allies. The German intelligence apparatus, while effective in many areas, struggled to grasp the full extent of this American potential. They understood that the US was a powerful industrial nation, but they underestimated the speed and efficiency with which it could convert its peacetime economy into a wartime juggernaut. They also underestimated the psychological resilience and the determination of the American people once provoked. Their own propaganda often portrayed the Americans as soft and decadent, incapable of sustained military effort. This misjudgment would prove to be catastrophic. Information, however, has a way of cutting through propaganda. In the chaos of war, documents are lost, captured, or simply overlooked. The precise circumstances surrounding the capture of the crucial American supply charts are shrouded in the fog of war, but historical accounts in military lore suggest it was likely a stroke of luck for the Germans, or perhaps a devastating oversight by the Allies. Imagine a convoy ship, perhaps damaged in an Atlantic U-boat attack but not sunk, its cargo salvaged. Or a downed American reconnaissance plane, its pilot killed, its sensitive documents scattered across enemy territory. Maybe it was a captured outpost in North Africa, overrun by Rommel's forces, where a filing cabinet contained the very data that would seal Germany's fate. Regardless of the exact scenario, these documents, intended for American logistical planners, found their way into German hands. These weren't flashy battle plans or secret weapon designs. They were raw data, shipping schedules, production figures for various war materials, projected delivery timelines, and the sheer volume of resources being moved across the Atlantic. They detailed everything from the number of new ships being launched each month to the tonnage of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment being transported from American ports to the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. These were the mundane, day-to-day workings of a global supply chain, meticulously recorded. The documents landed on the desks of analysts within the German High Command's intelligence section. These were not frontline soldiers, but highly trained statisticians, economists, and military logistics experts. Their job was to sift through mountains of intercepted communications, aerial photographs, and captured documents to piece together an accurate picture of the enemy's capabilities and intentions. They were often cynical, accustomed to dealing with exaggerated claims and incomplete information. Initially, there might have been skepticism, a belief that these numbers were inflated, part of an Allied deception plan to demoralize the Axis. But as they cross-referenced the data with other intelligence, and as the patterns began to emerge, the grim truth became unavoidable. The meticulous process of analysis would have involved weeks, perhaps months, of painstaking work. Imagine them in their stark offices, perhaps in the Bendler block in Berlin, under the dim glow of electric lamps, surrounded by maps and charts. They would have used slide rules and early calculating machines, their fingers tracing columns of numbers, their minds trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they wanted to believe. They compared the figures to their own dwindling production rates, to the losses inflicted by their U-boats, to the known capacities of Allied ports. And then, the revelation. It wasn't a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, creeping dread. The charts showed that the United States was not just producing war materials, it was producing them at a rate that dwarfed anything Germany, or indeed any nation in history, had ever achieved. They saw the number of Liberty ships, those utilitarian cargo vessels, being built, not dozens, but hundreds, and then thousands. The Allied shipping losses due to U-boat attacks, while significant, were being replaced faster than Germany could sink them. The graphs on the American charts didn't just show a rising line of production. They showed a steeply rising line, an exponential growth that defied all previous military calculations. The analysts would have seen, in stark numerical terms, that the United States was able to deliver more supplies to Britain and North Africa each month than Germany could even produce in the same period. let alone deliver to its own distant fronts. They saw the sheer tonnage of fuel, the endless stream of tanks, trucks, and aircraft. They realized that even if the German U-boats somehow managed to sink every single ship in a given convoy, another, even larger convoy was already being assembled, packed with even more materials. The American industrial base was so vast, so flexible, and so resilient that it could absorb staggering losses and still increase its output. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a teacup. This wasn't just about raw numbers. It was about the sustainability of the war effort. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that possessed an inexhaustible wellspring of resources and manpower, while Germany was struggling to find enough oil for its tanks and planes. The charts showed American oil fields pumping out millions of barrels, destined for the Allied war effort, while German factories were being bombed and their workforce depleted. American factories, safe across the ocean, were operating at peak efficiency, churning out war materials around the clock. The psychological impact of this discovery on the German analysts must have been profound. It wasn't just that they were losing, it was that they could not possibly win. The war was not going to be decided by tactical brilliance or the courage of their soldiers. It was going to be decided by the cold, hard mathematics of production and logistics. The numbers on those captured American charts laid bare the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. Germany, with its brilliant, but ultimately finite resources, was up against an industrial leviathan that could simply outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately outlast them. Let's break down this logistical disparity even further. Germany relied heavily on its railway network for internal transport and to supply the Eastern Front. While efficient, it was vulnerable to sabotage and bombing, and the gauge differences in Eastern Europe required cumbersome transshipment. Furthermore, locomotives and rolling stock were themselves a drain on industrial resources. For overseas transport, Germany was almost entirely dependent on its U-boat fleet for offensive action against Allied shipping. But it had no significant merchant marine to project its own power globally. The Allies, particularly the United States, had a fundamentally different approach. They had a vast merchant fleet, constantly growing, thanks to the Liberty ship program. These ships, though slow, were simple to build in enormous quantities, and they formed the backbone of the bridge of ships across the Atlantic. They were protected by an increasingly effective convoy system, aided by long-range aircraft, radar, and advanced anti-submarine warfare techniques. The sheer volume of goods they could transport was staggering. Imagine not just tanks and planes, but also the fuel to run them, the spare parts to maintain them, the ammunition to fire them, and the food to feed the soldiers operating them. Every single item, down to the smallest bolt, had to be manufactured, packaged, and shipped thousands of miles. The American charts showed that this monumental task was being accomplished not just adequately, but with a margin of abundance that verged on obscene from the German perspective. This understanding also had profound implications for the Eastern Front. Germany was fighting a brutal, attritional war against the Soviet Union, a conflict that was devouring men and material at an alarming rate. The Red Army, initially reeling from the German onslaught, was being resupplied and re-equipped, not just by its own factories, which had been moved eastward beyond the Europe, but also by massive quantities of Lend-Lease aid from the Western Allies. The American charts confirmed that this flow of Western supplies, trucks, locomotives, aircraft, raw materials, food, was substantial and growing. It meant that even if Germany inflicted devastating defeats on the Soviets, the Red Army would simply be rebuilt and rearmed with Western help, while Germany's own capacity to replace losses was diminishing. It was a war on two fronts, and both fronts were being supplied by an inexhaustible enemy. The revelation from these charts, while perhaps not immediately leading to a dramatic shift in German strategy, certainly fed into the growing sense of desperation within the high command. While Hitler continued to cling to fantasies of wonder weapons and miraculous reversals, many of his generals and military planners, those who understood the cold, hard realities of logistics, must have seen the writing on the wall. This wasn't a morale blow for the common soldier on the front, who knew nothing of these charts, but for the strategists, the ones tasked with winning the war. It was an intellectual death blow. It confirmed that the war was unwinnable, not because of a lack of courage or skill, but because of an insurmountable industrial and logistical disparity. The captured charts highlighted several key areas where the Allies, particularly the US, held an undeniable advantage. First, raw materials. The US had abundant access to iron ore, coal, oil, timber, and a vast array of other natural resources within its own borders or readily accessible from its allies and colonial holdings. Germany, on the other hand, had to fight for oil in the Caucasus, for iron ore in Sweden, and for other critical materials through conquest or blockade running, always at great cost and risk. The charts showed the raw material inputs for American production lines, confirming this vast natural advantage. Second, industrial capacity and efficiency. American factories were not just big, they were designed for mass production, often using assembly line techniques perfected decades earlier. They could quickly retool from civilian goods to military hardware. The charts would have detailed the specific output rates for various items. How many tanks? How many planes? How many trucks were being produced per month? These figures would have dwarfed Germany's best efforts, even as German factories came under increasing air attack. The analysts would have seen that American production was not just steady, but accelerating, even as the war progressed. Third, shipping and logistics. This was perhaps the most devastating revelation. Germany's U-boat campaign was designed to sever the transatlantic supply lines, starving Britain and preventing American forces and material from reaching Europe. The charts, however, demonstrated the complete failure of this strategy in the long run. They showed the number of ships built, the speed of construction, and the redundancy of the Allied supply network. Even with losses, the total tonnage delivered was constantly increasing. This proved that the bridge of ships was not just a propaganda slogan, but a tangible, growing reality. The analysts likely saw not just the number of ships, but the specific routes, the convoy sizes, and the efficiency of port operations, all pointing to an unstoppable logistical behemoth. Fourth, manpower and labor. While Germany was draining its workforce for the military and relying on forced labor from occupied territories, the US had a vast and relatively untapped labor pool. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, and the civilian population generally maintained a higher standard of living than their German counterparts, preventing widespread social unrest or exhaustion. The charts might not have directly shown manpower statistics, but the sheer volume of production implied an enormous and sustainable labor force. The moment of climax, the moment this grim truth fully permeated the German high command, would have been a stark, sobering experience. Imagine the lead analyst, perhaps a quiet, meticulous man named Dr. Schmidt or Professor Wagner, presenting his findings to a room of stern-faced generals and field marshals. The air would be thick with tension, perhaps a cloud of cigar smoke. Maps would be spread across a large table, but the true battle was being fought on the projected charts and graphs. He wouldn't need to use flowery language. He would simply present the numbers. Gentlemen, he might begin, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. Our analysis of the recently acquired American supply charts reveals a situation far more dire than previously estimated. He would point to a graph showing the exponential increase in Liberty ship construction, then another detailing the monthly tonnage of war material flowing across the Atlantic. Our U-boat campaign, while inflicting losses, is being overwhelmed. For every ship we sink, they are building 2, or even 3. Their total delivered tonnage continues to rise, despite our best efforts. He would then move to production figures. Their output of tanks, aircraft, and motorized vehicles is simply staggering. We are currently producing X tanks per month. The Americans are producing YY is 5. Perhaps 6 times X. They can replace their losses almost instantaneously, while our own production is under constant pressure from Allied bombing and resource shortages. He would show charts illustrating the vast reserves of oil and raw materials available to the Allies, contrasted with Germany's dwindling reserves and desperate search for fuel. The generals, accustomed to hearing optimistic reports and promises of victory, would initially be incredulous, perhaps even angry. These numbers must be exaggerated. One might thunder, enemy propaganda, but the analyst would calmly present corroborating evidence, cross-referenced data from aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and reports from their own agents. He would explain the methodology, the painstaking verification. The numbers, cold and impartial, would speak for themselves. The room would fall silent. The initial bluster would give way to a grim, chilling realization. This wasn't a temporary setback. It was a fundamental, structural imbalance. It was the understanding that no matter how brilliantly their armies fought, no matter how many battles they won, they were fighting an enemy that could simply manufacture more, ship more, and outlast them. The war was not a chess match where a clever move could secure victory. It was a game of endless resources, and Germany had already run out of pieces. The charts didn't just show a defeat. They showed the impossibility of victory. The grand ambition of the Third Reich, built on military prowess and ideological zeal, was being choked by a tide of American-made steel, oil, and ammunition. This moment, though uncelebrated in history books focusing on battles, was a true turning point. It stripped away any remaining illusions among the German high command. They would continue to fight, driven by fanaticism, desperation, and the fear of what awaited them in defeat. But the strategic understanding had fundamentally shifted. The war was no longer about winning. It was about delaying the inevitable, about fighting to the last man, or perhaps, about finding a way to negotiate a less catastrophic surrender. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich, built on conquest and military might, was revealed to be nothing more than a statistical impossibility. In the end, the Second World War was not just a clash of ideologies or a test of military skill. It was a brutal, industrial-scale conflict that demanded unprecedented levels of production and logistical support. Germany, with its initial brilliance and tactical innovation, simply could not compete with the combined industrial might of the Allies, particularly the United States. Those captured American supply charts, filled with seemingly mundane numbers, provided the undeniable proof. They showed that even if the German armies had been twice as effective, even if their U-boats had been twice as deadly, they would still have been drowned under an unstoppable tide of Allied material. The war, in its most fundamental sense, was won not just on the beaches of Normandy or the frozen plains of Stalingrad, but in the shipyards, factories, and oil fields of America. It was won by the sheer, overwhelming power of logistics, a truth laid bare for the German analysts in a few simple, devastating charts. If you found this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of war fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories from history. It was won by the sheer, overwhelming power of logistics, a truth laid bare for the German analysts in a few simple, devastating charts. The implications of these charts rippled through the higher echelons of the German military and economic ministries. It wasn't just a grim forecast. It was an undeniable, mathematical certainty that their meticulously planned war, built on speed and decisive victories, had stumbled into a quagmire of numbers it could not escape. Imagine the discussions, hushed and tense, behind closed doors in the Bentley block. The analysts, perhaps initially dismissed as overly pessimistic academics, now held a terrifying authority, their data irrefutable. They could show, with precise figures, that the attrition rate of Allied shipping, even at its peak during the U-boat onslaught, was consistently being outpaced by the rate of new ship construction in American yards. They could demonstrate that the tonnage of war materials, steel, oil, rubber, food, ammunition delivered to the battlefronts by the Allies, was not merely sufficient, but superabundant, a seemingly endless torrent that mocked Germany's own desperate scramble for every barrel of oil or ton of iron ore. This wasn't just about America's existing capacity. It was about its ability to scale. The charts likely detailed the incredible speed with which U.S. factories, previously churning out automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines, had been completely retooled for war production. These weren't minor adjustments. These were industrial revolutions happening in months, sometimes weeks. General Motors, a titan of car manufacturing, transformed itself into an arsenal, producing tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. Ford's Willow Run plant, a marvel of modern engineering, began producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of one every hour, a feat that astounded even Allied observers, let alone the Germans, who were struggling to maintain their own aircraft production. Under relentless bombing, the analysts would have seen the projected output for these industrial giants, and the sheer scale would have been mind-numbing. It wasn't just about what America had, but what it could become in a wartime economy. The concept of lend, often downplayed by German propaganda as a desperate measure by a bankrupt Britain, also took on a terrifying new dimension through these charts. The analysts would have seen the vast quantities of equipment, food, and raw materials flowing to the Soviet Union and Great Britain, essentially fueling the war efforts of Germany's other major enemies. Thousands of American trucks, like the Studebaker R6, were proving invaluable on the Eastern Front, transporting Soviet troops and supplies across vast distances. American aircraft, like the P-39 Air Cobra and the B-25 Mitchell, were bolstering Allied air forces. Even mundane items, from spam to boots, played a critical role in sustaining the Allied war machine. The charts detailed this flow, making it clear that Germany wasn't just fighting America, it was fighting a globally supplied coalition, with America as its seemingly limitless arsenal. The U-boat campaign. once the great hope for starving Britain into submission and preventing American intervention, was revealed as a tragically insufficient effort in the face of this industrial might. Early in the war, the U-boats were devastatingly effective, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping. But as the war progressed, the charts showed that Allied countermeasures were not just catching up, but surging ahead. The analysts would have seen reports of new escort carriers, smaller aircraft carriers dedicated solely to convoy protection, launching planes that could spot and attack U-boats far from shore. They would have seen the proliferation of long-range patrol aircraft, armed with radar and depth charges, patrolling the Atlantic. The development of advanced sonar, ASDIC, high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, or HFDF, and improved depth charges meant that U-boats, once hunters, were increasingly becoming the hunted. Most importantly, the cracking of the German Enigma code, a secret unknown to the Germans, allowed the Allies to reroute convoys away from U-boat wolfpacks, dramatically reducing shipping losses. The charts, showing the ever-increasing flow of goods despite the U-boat efforts, were a stark testament to the failure of their primary naval strategy. For Germany, every resource was a struggle. Their oil supply was a constant headache. Germany had very limited natural oil reserves and relied heavily on imports from Romania and, increasingly, on synthetic fuel production from coal liquefaction. The charts would have underscored this vulnerability. While America was pumping millions of barrels of crude oil, Germany was pouring immense resources into complex and vulnerable synthetic fuel plants. These plants, vital for their tanks, aircraft, and U-boats, became prime targets for Allied strategic bombing, further exacerbating their fuel crisis. The desperate push towards the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, culminating in the disastrous Battle of Stalingrad, was a direct result of this crippling resource dependency. A dependency made brutally clear by the American data railway system, while efficient for its time, was also under immense strain. It had to transport troops and supplies to the vast Eastern Front, maintain the German industrial heartland, and supply garrisons across occupied Europe. Unlike the Allies, who could utilize ocean transport for massive shipments, Germany relied predominantly on rail and road. The immense distances in Russia, coupled with the differing rail gauges, created bottlenecks and logistical nightmares. The charts, showing the sheer volume of Allied overland and sea transport, would have highlighted the comparative inefficiency and vulnerability of Germany's landlocked logistical network. The analysts also understood the impact of manpower. While the US had a vast population that could be mobilized for both military and industrial efforts, Germany's population was significantly smaller. Early war victories meant a rapid expansion of the military, but the endless attrition on the Eastern Front quickly devoured their best and brightest. By the later years of the war, Germany was resorting to drafting older men, younger boys, and increasingly relying on forced labor from occupied territories to man its factories and farms. This reliance on forced labor, while providing a temporary boost, was inherently inefficient and created long-term resentment. The American charts, implicitly, spoke to a robust and willing workforce, capable of sustaining wartime production without the same level of internal strain or ethical compromises. The revelation from these charts wasn't something that Hitler, in his increasingly delusional state, would have readily accepted. He was a man who believed in the power of will, of destiny, and of technological superiority. He often dismissed logistical concerns as the complaints of defeatist generals. His focus shifted to wonder weapons, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, jet fighters like the Me-262, and advanced U-boats. Believing these technological marvels could somehow bypass the fundamental mathematical realities of the war, he clung to the hope that these innovations, or a sudden political shift among the Allies, could still secure victory. But for the German High Command, the men tasked with the practicalities of fighting the war, the charts confirmed their deepest fears. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, or Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the critical role of logistics. Speer, in particular, was acutely aware of Germany's resource limitations and the devastating impact of Allied bombing on his factories. The captured American data would have served as a cold, hard reinforcement of what many of them already suspected. The war was unwinnable on a purely material basis. This realization led to a subtle but significant shift in German strategy. While the official rhetoric remained defiant, the underlying objectives began to change. From 1943 onwards, the strategic goal was no longer outright victory through conquest, but increasingly one of delaying the inevitable, of inflicting enough casualties on the Allies to force a negotiated peace, or at least to secure more favorable terms of surrender. This understanding fueled desperate counteroffensives, like the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, where the Germans threw their last reserves into a desperate gamble, hoping to split the Allied lines and seize vital supplies. But even this bold offensive, initially successful, quickly stalled due to a lack of fuel and logistical support, once again proving the supremacy of Allied supply chains. The American charts had predicted this outcome by showing the vast reserves of fuel and equipment the Allies could bring to bear. The psychological toll on those who understood this truth must have been immense. Imagine being a brilliant strategist, trained to find weaknesses and exploit them, only to discover that your enemy has no exploitable weakness in the most fundamental aspect of war: its ability to sustain itself. It's like being a chess master who realizes his opponent has an infinite number of queens. Every tactical victory, every brave stand, every heroic sacrifice seemed to shrink in significance when confronted with a relentless, overwhelming tide of Allied production. The story of those captured charts is not just a footnote. It's a testament to the fact that war, at its core, is an economic and industrial contest as much as it is a military one. The popular narrative often focuses on grand battles, heroic leaders, and dramatic turning points on the battlefield. But beneath all that, the silent, relentless churn of factories, the disciplined flow of ships across oceans, and the meticulous planning of logistics determine the ultimate outcome: the ability to produce, transport, and sustain a fighting force on a global scale was the ultimate weapon of the Second World War. Consider the sheer scale of the American contribution. By 1944, the US was producing more aircraft than all the other belligerents combined. It launched more merchant ships in a single year than Germany built U-boats throughout the entire war. Its industrial output had doubled, then tripled, becoming the engine that drove the Allied war effort. This wasn't just about quantitative superiority. It was about the quality and standardization of equipment. American jeeps, trucks, and tanks were reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in such vast quantities that they became ubiquitous across every Allied front. The charts showed that this wasn't accidental. It was the result of a deliberate, efficient, and well-managed industrial mobilization. The Germans, by contrast, often struggled with standardization. Different factories produced variations of the same equipment, making spare parts difficult to interchange. Their tanks, while often superior in individual design to their Allied counterparts, were complex, expensive to produce, and required immense maintenance. The Tiger tank, a formidable weapon, was a logistical nightmare, requiring specialized transport and consuming vast amounts of fuel. The American charts would have highlighted this contrast: simplicity in mass production versus complexity in limited numbers. The war also became a battle of infrastructure. While the Allies were constantly expanding their port capacities, building new airfields, and laying pipelines like Pluto pipeline under the ocean, supplying fuel to Allied forces after D-Day, Germany's infrastructure was systematically dismantled by Allied strategic bombing. Railway marshalling yards, bridges, oil refineries, and factories were relentlessly targeted. This bombing campaign, often controversial for its civilian casualties, played a crucial role in crippling Germany's ability to produce and transport. The very materials the American charts showed were so abundant for the Allies. The German analysts, seeing the American data on their own bombing capacity, would have further understood the hopelessness of their situation. Not only could they not match Allied production, but their capacity to produce anything at all was under constant, destructive assault. The final days of the war in Europe, with Germany squeezed between the advancing Soviet armies from the east and the Western Allies from the west, were a brutal testament to this logistical reality. German units were constantly short of fuel, ammunition, and food. Their tanks ran dry, their planes stayed grounded, and their soldiers fought with dwindling supplies against an enemy that seemed to have an endless stream of everything. The brave last stands, the desperate resistance, were ultimately futile in the face of an enemy that could simply bring more to bear, day after day, week after week. The charts had predicted this endgame years in advance. The lesson learned from those captured American supply charts extends far beyond the Second World War, underscores the fundamental principle that military power is inextricably linked to economic and industrial strength. A nation's ability to project power, sustain a conflict, and ultimately prevail depends not just on the courage of its soldiers or the genius of its generals, but on the unglamorous, yet absolutely vital, backbone of logistics and production. It's a lesson that continues to resonate in modern geopolitics, where economic might often dictate strategic influence. So, while we rightly remember the heroes on the battlefields, the strategists in the war rooms, and the victims of unimaginable brutality, it's also worth pausing to consider those quiet German analysts. In a smoke-filled room, surrounded by charts and numbers, they saw the future of their nation, not in a grand strategic defeat, but in the relentless, overwhelming tide of American factories and shipping lanes. They understood, perhaps before anyone else in Germany, that the war was already lost, decided not by bombs or bullets, but by the cold, hard reality of industrial might. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the most devastating truths are found not in the roar of cannons, but in the silent, unassuming columns of a ledger. If you're fascinated by these deeper, often overlooked stories of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button to join our community. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the most devastating truths are found not in the roar of cannons, but in the silent, unassuming columns of a ledger. The sheer overwhelming scale of American production wasn't just about raw numbers. It was about the flexibility and adaptability of the American industrial base. Unlike Germany, where specialized industries were often concentrated and vulnerable, the US had a geographically diverse industrial landscape. Factories across the country, from the Great Lakes to the West Coast, could contribute to the war effort, making it incredibly difficult for any single attack or disruption to cripple overall production. The American analysts, in creating the charts that the Germans later studied, were tracking not just output, but capacity, redundancy, and the potential for rapid expansion. This level of detail would have been particularly chilling for the Germans, who knew their own industrial heartland was increasingly becoming a prime target for Allied bombers, with every lost factory a permanent and irreplaceable blow. The quality of American logistics was also a critical factor. While Germany struggled with maintaining its vehicles on the vast, often unpaved roads of the Eastern Front, America was producing millions of robust, standardized trucks and jeeps. The iconic Deuce-and-a-half GMCC CKW truck became the backbone of Allied supply lines, capable of traversing challenging terrain and carrying immense loads. These vehicles were designed for durability and ease of maintenance, a stark contrast to some of the over-engineered and fragile German equipment. The charts, by detailing the types and quantities of transport vehicles, would have painted a picture of an enemy that not only had vast supplies, but also the means to move them efficiently and reliably to wherever they were needed. A stark contrast to the German experience of constantly battling maintenance issues and fuel shortages. Consider also the strategic implications for the German military leadership. When the war began, German strategy was built on the premise of a series of short, decisive campaigns. The idea was to avoid a prolonged war of attrition at all costs, precisely because Germany lacked deep reserves of manpower and resources to win such a conflict. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactical doctrine, it was a strategic imperative born of resource constraints. The captured American charts revealed that this core strategic assumption had been utterly invalidated. Germany was now embroiled in precisely the kind of war it could not win, a war of attrition against an adversary with virtually limitless resources. This wasn't a failure of German tactics on the battlefield, but a fundamental strategic miscalculation at the highest levels, now laid bare by objective data. The revelation from these charts also had a profound impact on the morale of those within the German high command, who understood their implications. While the common soldier fought bravely, often with fierce loyalty and belief in their cause, the leadership, confronted with these numbers, faced a growing sense of despair. How do you motivate an army to fight when you know, deep down, that victory is mathematically impossible? This knowledge must have fueled the internal dissent, the quiet questioning, and perhaps even the desperate attempts to find alternative paths, however unrealistic. The 20th of July plot, the assassination attempt on Hitler, can be seen in part as a reflection of this growing despair among certain elements of the German military, who recognized the futility of continuing a war that was already lost. While the plotters' motivations were complex, the strategic unwinnability of the war certainly played a role in their desperation. The contrast in resource management was also stark. Germany, driven by ideological expansionism, often plundered resources from occupied territories in a chaotic and unsustainable manner. This approach alienated local populations and often led to inefficient utilization of seized assets. The Allies, particularly the US, operated on a global scale with a highly organized and centralized resource allocation system. The American charts would have reflected this efficiency, showing carefully planned distribution networks and optimized supply chains, designed to get the right material to the right place at the right time. This wasn't just about having more stuff. It was about being better at managing and deploying what they had. The impact of air superiority, a crucial factor in the later stages of the war, also becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of logistics. Allied air forces, fueled by American oil and equipped with American-made planes, gained overwhelming control of the skies over Europe. This air superiority allowed them to disrupt German supply lines, bomb factories, and interdict troop movements, further exacerbating Germany's logistical woes. The charts, detailing the vast production of Allied aircraft and aviation fuel, would have underscored the impossibility of Germany ever regaining air parity, let alone superiority. This meant that every German convoy, every train, every factory was operating under the constant threat of attack, while Allied supply lines, though not immune, were far more secure and resilient. The analysts would have also seen, in the American data, the long-term planning that went into the Allied war effort. These weren't just snapshots of current production. They were projections, plans for future expansion, and anticipated needs. This indicated a strategic foresight and confidence that Germany, constantly scrambling to react to events and plug immediate holes, could never match. The Americans were planning for a war that would last years, with ever-increasing commitments. While the Germans were desperately hoping for a quick end to a conflict they were increasingly losing control over. This difference in outlook, implicitly revealed by the charts, was perhaps the most disheartening realization of all. The story of the captured supply charts is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped by unseen forces and unglamorous details. While the roar of tanks and the flash of artillery grab our attention, it is the silent, relentless flow of supplies, the output of factories, and the efficiency of logistical networks that ultimately determine the fate of nations in modern warfare. Germany's military prowess was undeniable, but it was ultimately crushed not just by Allied armies, but by the sheer overwhelming industrial might that those American supply charts so vividly represented. It was a defeat by numbers, a mathematical certainty that no amount of courage or tactical genius could overcome. This deeper understanding of the Second World War reminds us that the stories we tell often skim the surface. Real history is complex, multi-layered, and sometimes, the most profound revelations come from the most unexpected places. Those German analysts, poring over stacks of captured paper, weren't just reading figures. They were reading the epitaph of the Third Reich, written in the universal language of mathematics. Their discovery wasn't a turning point in a battle, but a turning point in understanding the inevitable. A moment when hope for victory died, not with a bang, but with a cold, hard click of an adding machine. If you want to keep exploring the hidden depths of history and uncover more untold stories, then make sure to subscribe to our channel right now.